When most people talk about Rare's best games, it almost frequently centers around their platformers. Battletoads, Donkey Kong Country, Banjo-Kazooie, and even Conker. I never cared for their platformers, but I always held Perfect Dark in very high regard. But the follow-up, Perfect Dark Zero, one of many launch titles for the Xbox 360, had a very mixed reputation, much like every other title Rare had made after splitting ties with Nintendo. I first played PDZ almost 10 years ago when I bought a used copy from a local GameStop for dirt cheap. Like everyone else, teenage me loved the original and its remaster, but I wasn't too impressed with Zero. I kinda dropped it after the first mission and went back to playing DJ Hero. I've grown a lot since then, both literally and in terms of how I view the games that I play. With the new generation on the horizon and the 15th anniversary of an old generation behind us, I decided to dust this game off and revisit it. And honestly, it's a lot better than I remember. Where the first Perfect Dark was a culmination of everything Rareware had learned working on N64 hardware, Zero was Rare's christening of a new generation, but it didn't start that way. Perfect Dark Zero began development on the Nintendo GameCube, but moved to the Xbox after their acquisition by Microsoft. Development had stalled and restarted once again as the 360 was on the horizon, and probably because Microsoft wanted an FPS to fill the void while Halo was on break. People put a lot of stock into launch titles when a new console arrives, but I feel that there's only a handful of consoles that I would say had launch titles that set a standard. For every Halo Combat Evolved, Soul Calibur, and Mario 64, there are plenty more Fusion Frenzies, Knacks, and Red Steels that get shuffled to the side once more polished titles come out. And not to say that these kinds of games aren't important, launch titles are definitely important in the short term, but I feel that they are best used as a long-term baseline showing how far we've come as time progresses. To me, launch titles should be treated like concept cars, an experimental what-if meant to be a glimpse into a future that may or may not come. And I bring all of this up because Zero is the most launch title of launch titles. So much about this game's design comes from what was in vogue in 2005 and what the developers figured would be in vogue for the rest of the generation. There's cover shooting, there's physics and ragdolls, hacking minigames, and extreme use of bump mapping. Some of those bets paid off. Some of those bets didn't. The cover shooting in this game is pretty finicky, and it's not always clear what can or can't be used as cover. Now, I'm a little generous about this because it is pre-Gears of War cover shooting, but not being able to move while behind cover is a real pain in the ass. There's physics, but it doesn't feel like there's any proper weight to your movement, everything feels like it's moving in low gravity, and it lacks the necessary balance of smooth movement and speed that you'd come to expect from a console FPS of this time, and the spongy enemies do not help this. I can only imagine the number of people who have come from Halo 2, which released a year prior, to this, and just being completely thrown off. And speaking of the original Xbox, the character models have a lot of detail, but move and talk in cutscenes as awkwardly as games from the previous generation, and makes me feel that if Rare had an extra year or more personnel, it probably would have looked a lot smoother. And for a while, that is the impression most people had of this game. A janky, goofy-looking sequel, prequel, pre-sequel, I don't know, ruined by trying to catch up with modern trends. But the more I played it, the more I realized that Zero had a real ace up its sleeve. Zero continues the game design philosophy of the first Perfect Dark and GoldenEye, where each mission has a list of explicit objectives you need to complete, and the difficulty adjusts the amount and complexity of each objective, but with some smart changes. Before you load into a mission, you have the option to pick and choose a loadout. You get 4 slots for weapons. Smaller handguns take up 1 slot, while larger guns like the shotgun and sniper rifle can take up 2 or 3. Many of the weapons from the first game return here, though a few have some slight changes and renaming. The sniper rifle and Farsight have been retooled as the Jackal and Shockwave, with the former being a reference to the Jackals from Halo, and the latter functioning the same as said Jackal's beam rifle. I'm not too broken up about the changes to how some of the weapons work, because gamers and developers alike had increased expectations for how weapon balancing should be in an FPS since the year 2000, and, well, the first Perfect Dark's weapons are cartoonishly unbalanced by today's standards, which, granted, kinda adds to the appeal. Most people point to the Farsight as the most overpowered weapon in the game, if not the entire genre, and it kinda is, because it's the Quake 3 railgun, but with built-in wall hacking. But I think the CMP-150 is a better example because it has an insanely high rate of fire, with high hipfire accuracy, no recoil, a secondary mode that auto-targets enemies, and it is an incredibly common weapon that both the player and enemies can easily get a hold of. The closest I can think of, a submachine like that in modern shooters is the Recluse in Destiny 2, and even before it was nerfed, it still can't hold a candle to the OG. And while the gunplay is iffy, it isn't entirely broken. Just like the first game, the AI in Zero can be pretty dumb and bullyable, giving you some satisfying moments of chaos. I know some people have had mixed feelings on 2-weapon limits becoming the standard for shooters since the 7th generation, but I think this is a case where it kind of made sense and actually added something interesting to the gameplay as opposed to just following a trend. You can't carry a massive arsenal on you like you could in the first game, but it also forces you to think hard about your playstyle due to the variety and usefulness of each gun. And that kind of makes sense, since you are a secret agent after all. Speaking of things a secret agent has, you also get to select one gadget to bring with you: a data thief, which hacks terminals, a demo kit, a timed explosive, and a locktopus, which locks or unlocks doors. Gadgets in the first game were often unique to that mission, whereas in Zero, each mission will use at least one of the 3. Now, granted, it is worth mentioning that you can only change your gadget after completing a mission once, but whatever gadget you pick will set up how you approach certain objectives. For example, in Mission 3, your primary objective is to grab a briefcase locked away in a safe room. You can crack the door's code with a data thief, or blow through a nearby hole with the demo kit, or if you have neither, go upstairs and find the actual code lying around somewhere. There's also support objectives, optional objectives on top of your primary ones with no penalty for failure, but are slightly harder and require you to go off the beaten path and don't always spell out exactly what you need to do. Some of them can be a little obtuse, so I do recommend having a guide on standby to figure it out if you get stuck, but when you do manage to pull it off on your own, it's pretty satisfying. These can be things like, say, creating a diversion between two enemy gangs by headshotting one without being noticed, or evacuating civilians from a nightclub by flipping a fire alarm so they don't get caught in the eventual firefight, or stealing a rocket launcher from an enemy turret and attaching it to your hovercraft so you have better firepower during your escape, or using that same rocket launcher turret to destroy other hovercrafts parked in the area, reducing the amount that can chase you when you eventually break out. My favorite example of this kind of gameplay is during Mission 8, where you have to break out of a Datadyne undersea base. One of your support objectives is slowing down Datadyne guards by having the demolitions guy in your team blow up certain points to close the door on them. However, when you get to these points, you'll be rushed by loads of Datadyne goons, and they can interrupt the demo guy, or worse, kill him. Having something with a high rate of fire, like the laptop gun, helps a lot, but it still kept aggravating me. As I kept running this mission though, I suspected that these soldiers weren't just spawning in from nowhere, but were coming from nearby rooms that I didn't enter. So I made sure to clear every room while also keeping the aggro on me, and lo and behold, only one guy came to shoot at us. I'm not sure if this was an intentional design choice on Rare's part, but I was really surprised that it worked, and I'm glad that it was a viable option. So, cool, thanks. The mission design isn't anywhere near Deus Ex levels of sandbox gameplay, but I feel at the end of the day, Zero does a little more with its mission and objectives than other linear FPSs of the time. But what about the other things? Well, I probably could have been like everyone else and spent a lot more time harping on the game's story and character design, but I never had a problem with it, even years ago when I first played it. The cutscenes when they talk sure haven't stood the test of time, but the fashion is so aggressively mid-2000s cool that it feels almost nostalgic. It's like seeing an old friend. And while I joked earlier about the strong use of bump mapping, the environments and lighting still look gorgeous so many years later, and it looks even better if you're running it on Xbox One X like me, as you'll get increased render resolutions, HDR support, and better performance. As for the story, it's flimsier than the first, and I don't get why they went for a prequel as opposed to a sequel, but I can't say I wasn't entertained. The whole tone of the game feels like the developers watched Charlie's Angels, Die Another Day, and Animatrix back to back and thought that they somehow weren't silly enough. And you know what? They were right. It's really hard for me to get mad when we get choice moments like this.
You okay?
Sure. I got a fractured shoulder, a mission in pieces, and I think he just busted my ego.
The soundtrack is also really good. I like it a lot. It doesn't have music throughout like the first game, but instead uses music to punctuate specific areas and set pieces, kind of like Half-Life. And I'm gonna be real, there's some real bangers in here. remember when I said earlier that launch titles are a glimpse into what developers think, or hope, will be the new standard for the rest of the generation? Well, I feel that to a T with Perfect Dark Zero. I don't know if it should have been the standard, because I think there's plenty of room for different takes on the genre, but it would have been great to see Rare or other third-party developers expand and refine on what made this game good. Though, I'm not exactly hungry for a sequel. Much of the talent on this game bailed years ago, and Microsoft of today doesn't seem to have a desire to revitalize old franchises. Now, while I was finishing the game and drafting the script for this video, I wanted to put my finger on the pulse and see what the modern consensus was on this game after so many years, and it's a mess. Now, I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting any come-to-Jesus moments. I wasn't expecting a huge number of people having epiphanies, realizing that this is a masterpiece of a game, but I was stunned at how many reviewers were so hyperbolic sometimes about the game's shortcomings, especially after all these years, you know? Part of the reason why I spent so much time talking about the loadouts and the mission design is not just because it stood out to me, but because I've noticed so few brought it up. I never bring up other people's opinions in my videos because, well, it's not about them, but this just incensed me so much that it was impossible for me to ignore. In fact, this video would have been done a few days sooner, but I had to go back and redraft my thoughts and add this whole section in. Now, I'm not going to feature any examples of said reviews here because I don't want to really give them a platform, and I'm not trying to turn this into a frame-by-frame reaction analysis video. It's already gone on long enough, so I'm leaving the research to you. Trust me, it's not very hard to find. But what I will say, and this is going to be a really hot take, is that I really, really wonder how much of this game's reputation as such a horrible shooter is the result of Rare fanboys with rose-tinted nostalgia goggles vacuum sealed to their faces, completely misrepresenting the game and just not understanding what it was trying to do. And I know that sounds really harsh and insulting, but it is really annoying watching so many people worshipping the classics with such zeal while being completely oblivious to the reality. And what do I mean by that? Well, the most consistent complaint I've seen about Zero is over the tone of the game and how over the top it is compared to the first. And while I do agree that Perfect Dark's story is more tonally serious than Zero, it's to a point. Because once you get to Area 51, which I think is only the 5th mission in the game, it takes a hard nosedive into sci-fi campiness with flying saucers and little gray aliens, one of which calls himself Elvis and wears a USA-style tank top. You have to rescue the president from being cloned. This is the game with Shigeru Miyamoto and Peter Molyneux's faces used in the bodyguards. This is the game with little models of cheese hidden around the place. This is the game with all sorts of wacky cheat codes and hammy voice acting.
You can't make accusations like that without evidence. I assume that you have some.
This is a game from a studio that has a storied history of making lighthearted games for kids. Perfect Dark is not Deus Ex or Alpha Protocol. There's plenty of campiness and levity in the game's story that it's weird that so many people have forgotten that. And after so many years of so many people from gaming magazines to forum posters ripping in to Perfect Dark Zero and proclaiming how awful it is and how much of a disappointment it was, when really it's fine. It really makes me question whether Rare's other titles post N64 are actually bad, or if they're just fine with some really interesting qualities. And honestly, there are so many other sequel shooters that I've played that I would put much lower on the totem pole, because even though they're more polished than Zero, I didn't find them nearly as interesting to play. Like, you want to know what else was on the Xbox 360 launch lineup? Quake 4. Quake 4. And that game was a bigger, more unoriginal trend chaser than Zero. The reason why I liked Perfect Dark and even GoldenEye is because of how cool I thought the characters were, because of how cool I thought the settings were, how fun the guns were to use, and how much effort and heart the developers put in to getting the most out of the hardware they had. And Zero, for all of its problems, for all of its weird changes, still delivered that experience for me, which is why I regret sleeping on it almost a decade ago. Both Zero and the original Perfect Dark have so many cool features and interesting design choices that have not been replicated by other FPSs since. And that is the moral of this story. That's what's important when judging a game, especially something with a contentious reputation. To not judge it based on some sort of ideal, but on what it was actually trying to accomplish. And you know what, Rare? Mission accomplished.